There's a lot of really kind of fascinating work. I will admit a lot of it sort of outside of my normal orbit of things that I find myself writing about and thinking about. So almost all of it was new to me. So, and actually a lot of the stuff from today was new to me. So I'm really, thank you, Ashley, and everybody that came for teaching me stuff. And I want to talk a little bit about the didactics of a lot of this work. But before I get to that, I'm kind of rattled by something Mira said. He said, I said I didn't know what I was going to say when we started this conversation. And you said, it's easy. They're all the same. And I don't think that's true. I think there's a lot of really important differences in the work of the four of you, but also in the work more broadly that we've seen today. But there is a similarity that I feel like I've been wrestling with all day, and it has to do with the way Ashley set this event up. And it's that every project is just absolutely packed with stuff. Information, cultural content, analysis, documentation, whatever, everything is just kind of covered. So there is a kind of blanket solution, which each of the presenters today, and I think the four of you in particular, have taken on, which is that we find these moments in the world and demonstrate their fecundity by unpacking them, right? So we demonstrate the fullness of the world. And if and I was thinking of this in terms of cultural fulfillment. I mean, cultural fulfillment is a much loftier kind of term than material or logistical fulfillment, which seems to have more kind of pragmatic, modernist kind of getting things done. But cultural fulfillment always has a kind of, it has this air of higher significance in a way. And I was looking at, definitions, and one of the things about the definition of culture, it's the collective intellectual achievements of a society. And, we often associate those objects or events that we consider to be culturally fulfilling. It's hard to kind of categorize them generally, but if we look at, we might say that Beethoven and Bach, kind of safe bets as culturally fulfilling. Britney Spears, probably less so, that there's a kind of classification of objects in terms of their cultural significance, which one of the great things about all of the work that, or a lot of the work that I saw today, is that there is a demonstration that those kinds of categories are false, that there's as much richness and possibility and significance in quite mundane or overlooked things. And so some of the work that we saw today had to do with demonstrating that. I think, Leah, your documentary work is maybe the most poignant in that sense, where you kind of, by bracketing certain conditions in the world, you kind of call attention to them. I think your curatorial work, Luis, is similarly, kind of foregrounds existing conditions. Whereas in other cases, what we see is the design work is kind of looking at manufacturing that kind of the significance of the commonplace. So can I draw sex shops in the manner of architecture, of kind of high architecture? Can I begin to conceive of architectural facades as freighted with cultural and material significance? And so I think all of these projects really take on that, if warehouses are filled with products, culturally significant objects are filled with information or significance in some way. But where I find it tricky, it's trickier for me, the documentary work, I can make sense of in that way. The design work, and not just the design work that the two of you just presented, but also a lot of the design work that we saw today, it seems that significance requires a docent of some time. That a lot of the significance is not immediately apparent. It needs to be teased out. Its nuance must be demonstrated by a kind of cultural ambassador. And so each of you presented the work in that kind of ambassadorial role. And I wonder about that. I wonder if these observations resonate with you. I mean, it seems that a lot of the presentations today seem to reinforce the fact that culture is difficult, right? That Clement Greenberg was right all along, that culturally significant stuff requires work, that it requires a certain frame of attention, and there's a kind of laboriousness to it. And imagine that turned into like a really pointed question. And then answer it. Anyone, but you see that, you know, the themes that I find kind of emerging in the work that kind of resonate.
I mean, I think that you're right. Yes, I totally agree. I think that the challenge of, I guess I'll speak for myself, but I do kind of feel like there's so much synthesis that's taking place kind of collectively. But the kind of particularity of the work, is based on, and therefore maybe the docent, the requirement for a docent, I think is a sort of resistance to sort of kind of this idea of kind of a universal truthiness and a universal way of seeing, and a sort of pushback against that, and then in fact maybe the things that have seemed like it would be docent free, is maybe just docent free for some, or produce a sort of super monoculture about what is valuable and what can be seen, and what can be drawn. So to me, absolutely. I think that I don't love the fact that it's not always transparent, but I also think that that's okay, and that maybe more particularity in terms of audiences and when you get a joke and you don't get a joke.
Yeah.
Like, you know what I mean? Like, so maybe you don't always get the joke. You know?
I'm super familiar with people not getting the joke.
Yeah. I mean, to me, that's also what's at stake in, like, what's the kind of, not at stake. That would be my response. Yeah, like the sort of what is maybe at work in the sort of mechanics of delivery, of trying to tease out, is to say that maybe we need to work harder at producing things that are situated, that are very particularly situated, for a while.
Do you agree, Christina?
No.
Good.
But I don't get the question.
Well, let me ask it slightly more pointedly. Do you feel that your work requires you to explain it, or do you think that its significance would be or should be self-evident to an audience?
I think that it's self-evident. Well, it depends on the nature of the project. There's no microphone, no? I mean, do you hear? Yes. Yeah. No? It depends on the nature of the project. If you are doing a stadium, as I did in the past, for example, I don't think that you need to explain anything. You know, if it was full of inventions and it would create certain friction between the public, so then you don't have to go and explain anything really. I think that it's much more interesting when the process is a risk, really. I mean, it's this jump in the void, you don't know exactly what's going to happen. So it's true that at the end you have to reread in order to explain it for an audience that has to do with the discipline, no? For experts, let's say. But I would like to think that there has to be the two levels. So you can open really a discussion in the city, and then you can open a discussion that is more disciplinary.
Yeah. And do you see that kind of work happening in your exhibitions, Luis? That you're addressing multiple audiences simultaneously?
That's a very difficult question. I think that you pointed at Clement Greenberg, right? That to me was super interesting. But you pointed like at a text. Why don't we talk about the kitchens, right? Like there is a moral judgment when audience is getting involved, as if you're not trying to sort of like create a like a divide between disciplinary interests and normal press interests, and very ambitiously I remember when we did the Triennale, we said like, you want the competition, and you're like, yeah, and you're like, we want architectural projects to be featured in general media. we don't want, let's say, domus and all, which we want, you know, but we want to appear to that guy, like we want to make an exhibition which is relevant, which makes architecture relevant for some of the things which are going on elsewhere. And I would say like some of the things were successful, like the embassy, like was had like, you know, was mostly featured like in like Middle Eastern India, right? Like that was and that synchronicity for us was like what made it interesting. Like in order to try to bridge that sort of divide between the things which seem relevant to people and the things which seem disciplinary relevant is I don't like. I don't understand who's like putting so much effort in creating that it shouldn't be like that. Like I really like when I see like buildings at the center of like polemics, right? Like we invited this person, I don't know, Ramos Noeta, right? Because we wanted him to talk how during the Arab Spring, you know, people sort of protected the Library of Alexandria. Sort of very weird building that they did, which is like, I'm not that interested in that building per se, right? But I'm interested in the fact that suddenly people took architecture as like significant within something which going on in their daily lives. And like, to me, architecture was immediately resignified. Even like we can discuss how successful like is this really like sustainable, it's like public, but architecture was at the center of those things. And that for us was super, super, super exciting.
Yeah. And I mean, architecture is at the center of your work in a lot of ways, although you seem to, Leah, you move it again into that kind of documentary role. I think the tension that you build between the portals of capital and foreclosed houses, and how does the question of audience factor in as you make those kinds of images?
I think for me, that idea of audience is like, in a way, like super critical because I see it as more like a practice on media, and so a lot of the work that I've been doing, sometimes it comes across as a one-liner. Like it says something like in a really bold, like clear way, but I would like to think that it also has these nuances behind it depending on what your background is and how you perceive it. So on the one hand, a lot of the work that I do, I try to take, you know, I see, going back to maybe the first kind of statements you were saying, like today culture is essentially oversaturated. So I agree that there isn't an authority and a way of looking at it, and it requires people like us to kind of tease out the nuances and the intricacies. And for instance, I don't see the distinction between Mozart and Britney Spears.
Yeah.
I think actually everything is like flattened, and that allows us to work on these things that maybe someone might consider mundane. But anyway, to say, back to the audience question, like I think if we can see something in a way that like a large group of people can understand, and then also kind of build into it different nuances for people to kind of read into it based on their own experiences, that is important for my work.
Well, I think that in some ways I agree, but I also wonder about the role of expertise in such broadening conversations. I mean, I am similarly interested in how architecture addresses broader publics, and you know, this business about mandating classicism for federal buildings, which I've written about recently. You know, I mean, I think there's a very interesting question about how popular taste and disciplinary expertise intersect with one another, and so I wonder about that. Where do we place the role of the expert in a project of, let's call it, audience proliferation? You know, because in some sense, there seems to be a drive in a lot of this work to kind of address a broader audience than the 15 experts who are also working on the same question. But then at the same time, there's also a massive amount of expertise on display. And there is the possibility of a very specific disciplinary conversation. So how do you negotiate those two desires?
Yeah, I would say that regardless, it's very important that there are centers that are specialized only in disciplinary discussions, so they have their own language, their own speed, so that things move forward, for sure, so they should exist. And then in terms of the architects in this process, I think that it changes in different parts of the world again. No? So for example, if we go to Europe, you go to my country, for instance, architects are the figure of the public intellectual. As an architect, let's say, it's visible and it's present. So architects are also politicians, and they write in newspapers, and they are like full citizens that get engaged in phenomena that happen in the city. So then there's certain discussion that crosses for sure, no? And in terms of the broaden the public for our work, I think that it's fundamental the work of certain curators, for example, as they did in Oslo. But also, there's always this lack of information. So, for example, you take any newspaper and you would see that there's a health section, there's a literature section, and there's not really like an architecture section, which means that people invest all the money that they have through their lives, maybe in a house, and they have absolutely no idea about what is a special quality or material quality. So it's very difficult to understand. No? So there's a lot of work to do in those lines, I think. Yeah.
I wonder if it's also a question of venue. We have certain places where we have these conversations, and that obviously produces a kind of audience that is familiar with them. But it's like, the New York Times doesn't have a venue for these types of architectural conversations, and then, like, curators are actually really interesting part to that, because they're the ones producing these new types of venues for people to come together, and in a way, like, we could start to think about different environments that would bring these different groups together and different conversations that happen as a result of that.
Mm-hmm. I don't know. I mean, I think it becomes, for me, tricky because again, the number of lessons that were taught today, there's a kind of didactics.
For me, it's like way smaller. Like I don't think about it like when you talked about the sort of how to like the sort of didacticism or like the cultural for me, it's way like I like students, I have a couple clients.
Yeah.
I have like the people who I teach with, the people that would read a piece of writing, like this. But I personally am not yet at a place where, I mean, there's been moments and touch points, and there's always this sort of anxiety and stress about how to reach a sort of much larger public and much larger audience. But from the way that I think about it, and my current contribution is much smaller, but also as sort of, to me, relevant in the sense that I don't think, when I was a student, nobody ever told me that I was allowed to like think certain things or discuss, to kind of criticize certain things. So for me, it's the cultural. It's much smaller. So I don't think that there has to be a conversation about the like publics, which are plural, and like a sort of larger thing. I think that some of the valuable things that are happening that we've seen are also things that are like disciplinary critiques and disciplinary contributions, and that to me is cultural within the discipline.
And a questioning of the idea of expertise, which we are like discussing without, like unfolding after like a thing which has been sort of been discussed in our approach is like the 2008 recession, right? Like I was precisely studying at that moment. I thought that I was never going to have any like single training opportunity to do it, and when that happened, and like I got used to it, that was fine. Expertise in architecture could be repurposed, as Christina was saying, in many other ways where I think that architects can be placed in, tables where decisions are being taken about the city, housing, many other things which do not necessarily imply traditional expertise as we understand as having a studio and doing a project, right? And I think that also, and the many layers that you were discussing, like if we situate that phenomenon, I think it has to do also with the 2008 crisis, which is like us, which were studying then, when we had the opportunity to do a project, it was like everything, it's gonna have more things than an auditorium, you know what I mean? It's like, we are not gonna say no to intensity, where there is no small project. And I think that in a way is a statement about what architectural expertise is, right? Like, it's like the layering associated to scale, to importance. Why cannot a house be as layered as, like an airport? And I think that has a lot to do also with the historical moment where we were trained.
I think that historical moment certainly had a big impact on an entire generation of architects. The not being able to get a job is kind of a buzzkill. But there are, I don't think this work can be reduced to describe it as simply the fallout of political or economic conditions is to miss actually most of what's going on in the work. And so that's where I maintain a kind of skepticism to a lot of the foregrounded context, let's call it. And for me, and I just want to say this one last thing, we'll open it up to the room and then move on to Anna, but for me what I come away from these 4 presentations with, what really sticks with me, are those moments that that seem to exist in excess of the thematics within which the works were presented. So I think about the just stunning wainscot, the blue tile and the split door and the way the paint works with the stain, just beautiful, right? And Leah, I think the ASMR videos, right? Like Keller explaining a paperweight. What's great about it is like, I don't need to know how to make a paperweight. I will never need to know how to make a paperweight, but to see, Keller whispering or Michael whispering or Keller kind of, that there's a kind of, there's a raw kind of aesthetic power to those things that totally exceeds any, and I think that goes with basically every image you make. I mean, there's a kind of poignancy to them that exceeds their content. Mira, I think the blanket facades as well. I mean, the way that the scale manipulations that you do as the material kind of folds on itself and it kind of looks like shingles and it's kind of too big and that there's an incredible richness to the arrangement of materials. I see, the way your background and Matthew's background kind of comes together is great. And then Christina, again, I think the drawings, the almost mechanistic depiction of some of the student projects, I guess, of the 7 sins. So for me, it's that there's what keeps this work firmly within the discipline of architecture are those moments where where it really is kind of. Well, let's put it. That's where I feel the most fulfilled. Like I feel like I'm like full up on lessons sometimes, but I never get sick of those kind of moments. And so for that, I would say, keep doing it. And then I would add, is there anyone want to jump in other than Anna, who has to? Zach.
So what's interesting to me about the panel control fulfillment is that there's a lot of questions around privacy, which leads me to think that at the end of the day, all we want to do is be in private. Based on some of the projects like the voyeurism and Leah's project, or I would say, Mary, you're also somewhat voyeuristic, standing outside people's homes when they're trying their utmost to be reclusive, right? And following people definitely on the streets of Tokyo. And so I guess one question would be, do you see yourselves as voyeurs or trespassers? And if so, is that necessary to the work, right? To necessarily cross the threshold between public and private, which is kind of like, age-old architectural argument. At the end of the day, is that all we're doing? And are we doing that in a way to sort of affirm privacy in a world where it seems like privacy is not possible? There was a question there.
Yeah. I'm seeing 4 yeses.
It's like some of our, I guess the question part is, do you view yourself as trespassers or voyeurs or something of the like, and do you think that role is necessary and productive?
In my work, particularly, for sure, yes. I mean, because it's true that now it seems that everything is documented, because internet, social networks, etc. But at the same time, of course, there's many bias that you can recognize in terms of certain topics, and this is why the book of things, no? I mean, there are areas that we totally ignore, and we think that we see everything, but we don't. We don't. So, and it's shocking when you actually get to these spaces and see the architecture, I mean, and study it in a typological way, for instance, in terms of the book of things. So, for sure, I think that's very important, at least for my work.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Christina's saying. And in the project, the last one I showed him while we were driving through Orange, New Jersey, with the camera on the car, like it was very uncomfortable, like doing that. But then in context of like that project was done, there was a series of architects working in other sites that were similar, and at the time I felt like while it like made my stomach hurt, like feeling like I was this person that was going and like capturing these people's like intimate lives. It also felt like all the work that was being done where people weren't going to the sites and doing this was also like was the same thing, and maybe it was important that we were actually going there. I went like so many times that summer and had many conversations. Like we drove slow enough that people would just walk next to us and talk to us while we're doing it. Like not to say that it needs to have that kind of like it needs to always be like that, but I think it makes me question like how that kind of work or something that feels more documentary or is like more intimately engaging this question of voyeurism or being an outsider is any worse or different than like the kinds of work in general that we do have where our users are people we design for, not ourselves.
Is it any worse or different than what Amazon is doing when it connects your mouse position?
Yes, it's different. I'm not profiting from it.
Yeah.
I'm not building like a whole regime around it. It's very different. But it's a really, I think it's a really good question. I'm still like not comfortable with like where, maybe it's good just to not be comfortable with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of my friend makes fun of me. It's like you were all like talking about colonialism. You are colonial. You were looking at this shit. I think there's something powerful about trying to lose visibility sometimes, and so I've stopped sort of telling myself that I can't do certain things because it's like not allowed, in order to sort of get at a particular knowledge, right?
Keith.
I'm going to pull it so I don't make a comment, not ask a question, or a question, but it goes back, it relates to this question of voyeurism and privacy, but also Todd, your continual probing about like the work needing to produce audiences outside of architecture. When in fact I think
Or look at this room within it.
Well, and I think that's actually where the audience needs to be produced, and what I find amazing about the work of this panel and all the panels today. And maybe kind of generational shift perhaps, is it's less about like finding ways to produce new audiences for architecture, but I think more about finding a way in which to make architecture and audiences of the world something to look more closely at the way that people operate in the world, to produce a kind of empathetic engagement with the world that we have participated in, bettering, understanding whatever you hope to be doing with your work, which I don't think necessitates finding ways to connect for these folks to connect with that world, but actually find ways that in their work they can understand the world that they're working in and the people they're working for. And I think that was maybe Leah's point towards the end there. So in all of it, certainly all of the four projects we saw today, you really see that empathetic, anthropological engagement. Forget I said it, all of them, right? It re-sterilizes it in a way that I think the work is not.
Yeah.
Sterile in its attempt to connect and make visible precisely for architects a way of engaging.
Yeah. Thank you, Keith. Okay. One more quick.
What is your greatest unfulfilled desire as architects?
You say unfulfilled?
Yeah. Your greatest unfulfilled desire as architects.
They're all unfulfilled.
Yeah.
All of them. Especially when you revisit them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
own thing. I think that's its own thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, but I think another way to ask that question is where is this work going? You know, so it could be that you know it becomes more intimately personal, as you were describing, Mira. Or it could be that it invents a new form of empathetic engagement, as Keith is pointing out. It could be that it works to reach broader audiences, to more profoundly produce political and cultural resonance, as I think, Luis, you are doing in your exhibition work. And so I think it's a question worth, you know, putting a little bit more pressure on it. Where do you see the work going? Nobody's gonna say.
I'm just trying to build as much as possible. That's but at the same time, I think that I had an opportunity to have do some programming at the Princeton show, and so we brought together James Welling, photographer, and Mario Gooden, writer at Columbia, and we talked about like multivalent like definitions and constructions of color, for instance. So like to me, it's like there may be a sort of, as things become more of a business within architectural terms, other kind of cultural depth is also a way of, I imagine, I would hope, would be able to build up alongside in terms of other kind of outputs. So, you know, like those two things to me don't have to always have to land directly on top of one another, but I do think that they can maybe sit side by side one another.
Yeah.
In my case, for me it's interesting the idea of the recuperation of the architect as a public intellectual, for sure, where we access conversations that in many places we can't sit on those tables at all.
Yeah.
So, and that this figure exists in many places in the world as well, as I was mentioning before. And the other is the architect as explorer, so we can reach to the spaces where normally we don't, for whatever reason. I mean, and this is why the book of things.
Yeah. Luis.
I have no idea where my practice is going. I'm actually doing a PhD at the same time.
Oh yeah, we know where you're going. Check back in when you're done.
No, but actually I don't. So if you do, please explain me. I think that
typing. That's where you're going.
One of the things that architectural expertise that we talk about to me is interesting is that can we understand everything which comes to our hands as a project, whatever is your documentary project, which is totally a project, because like I haven't seen like anyone documenting those houses like that. So to me, it's not a given. You are not going there and doing something which doesn't require to be planned, maybe to be sketched, maybe to be discussed, tested, and then produced, right? So, and that could be a book, no? Could be a building, and could be an exhibition, and could be a PhD, maybe, right? So I think that that's what I take, and that I think that for example, I don't want to say myself, but the methodology, right? That methodology of like understanding things as projects and testing them out and sketching them out and discussing them out is something which is applicable to many things. That's why now Harvard, the School of Business, is interested in the charrette / studio / architecture model, right? And maybe this is where the architectural expertise lies, rather than a fully designed building. And that's definitely something that interests me.
Leah.
I have the same feeling, but I don't have an answer for where it's going. I mean, maybe this is but I'm not sure that I am like, that's my goal necessarily in the work, is to like figure out exactly like how to produce something like that I have like a preconceived idea where it's going.
Yeah.
But I think for me it's like a methodology as a way of coming to terms with like the way what I was trained and what I do now, and how I can like understand the world. And at the same time, I think like maybe thinking a little bit about this idea of desire, like or pleasure, or it's also sometimes it's nice to like put things out there that like people will enjoy and or that I enjoy. And so part of it is like finding ways of understanding the world and then like reframing it, and maybe on some level it's
Yeah.
it's going to be an ongoing thing that evolves over time.
Well, I think the kind of open-ended answers are exactly the right ones to have. No, I mean it. I mean, I think that each of you are pretty aggressively and productively working to open up possibilities for the way an architect makes her or his way in the world. And I think that that is important work worth doing, and thank you for doing it. And let's close it up there.
Thank you.